Good day, everyone. Together with Angel Claire Enot, Ana Marie Ibrano, Renan Cesar, we will be discussing about structuralism and post-structuralism. Structuralism is a way of approaching texts and practices that is derived from theoretical work of the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. Its principal exponents are French, Louis Althusser in Marcel Curie, Roland Barthes in Literary and Cultural Studies, Michael Foucault in Philosophy and History, Jacques Lacan in Psychoanalysis, Claude Levi-Strauss in Anthropology, and Perry McCherry in Literary Theory. Their work is often very different, and at times very difficult. Structuralism is a method of interpreting and analyzing such things as language, literature, and society, which focuses on contrasting ideas or elements of structure and attempts to show how they relate to the whole structure. Structuralism holds that all human activity and its products, even perception and thought itself, are constructed and not natural. And in particular that everything has meaning because of the language system in which we operate. Structuralism played a role in the drive to make psychology a more experimental science. Structuralism as a term refers to various theories across the humanities, social sciences, and economics, many of which share the assumption that structural relationships between concepts vary between different cultures, language, and that this relationship can be usefully exposed and explored. Example of structuralism is describing your experience at the ocean by saying it is windy, salty, and cold, but rejuvenating.
Saussure divides language into two component parts, signifier and signified. Saussure's is a relational theory of language. It's produced not through a one-to-one relation to things in the world, but by establishing difference. Example, traffic lights operate within a system of four signs. Red is stop, green is go, amber is prepare for red, amber and red is prepare for green. Traffic lights would work equally well if red signified go and green signified stop. It is not by chance that the system functions, expressing a natural meaning, but by highlighting a distinction within a system of distinctions relationships. According to Saussure, made in a process of combination and selection horizontally along the syntagmatic axis and vertically along the paradigmatic axis. Example, in the sentence, Miriam made chicken broth today is meaningful through the accumulation of its different parts. Miriam made chicken broth today. Its meaning is only complete once the final word is spoken or inscribed. Saussure called this process the syntagmatic axis of language. One can add other parts to extend its meaningfulness. Miriam made chicken broth today while dreaming about her lover. Meaning is thus accumulated along the syntagmatic axis of language. This is perfectly clear when a sentence is interrupted. For example, I was going to say that it is clear to me that Louis should. The relationship between sign and referent is also arbitrary. The language we speak plays a significant role in shaping what constitutes the reality of material world. This is because it provides us with a conceptual map to impose a certain order on what we see and experience. Structuralists argue that language organizes and constructs our sense of reality. Different languages in effect produce different mapping of the real. An Inuit with over 50 words to describe snow would presumably see so much more than a European looking at the same landscape. Saussure distinguished between two theoretical approaches to linguistics. The diachronic approach studied the historical development of a given language, and the synchronic approach studies a given language in one particular moment in time. That he argues that in order to found a science of linguistics, it necessary to adopt a synchronic approach. Structuralism takes two basic ideas from Saussure's work: concerned with the underlying relations of text and practices the grammar that makes meaning possible, and the view that meaning is always the result of the interplay of relationships of selection and combination made possible by the underlying structure. In other words, texts and practices are studied as analogous to language, that the rule of structuralism is to make explicit the rules and conventions or the structures which govern the production of meaning or acts of parole. It is the underlying rules of cultural texts and practices that interest structuralists. It is this structure that makes meaning possible.
Claude Lévi-Strauss, Woolwright, and the American Western. So Claude Lévi-Strauss discovered the unconscious foundation of the so-called primitive societies using socio-structuralism, the langue and the parole. These two divisions of language Claude Lévi-Strauss used to determine culture of the so-called primitive societies. Before he discovered the culture of the so-called primitive societies, he first studied and analyzed the cooking, manners, mode of dress, aesthetic activity, and other form of cultural and social practices as analogous to system of language. As he analyzed, he determined that each of it is a medium of communication and a form of expression in its own unique way. So before we go further to our discussion, the meaning of the two divisions of language is what Claude Lévi-Strauss used. Langue refers to the rules behind the way the language is arranged and used, while parole refers to the actual utterance of language, both written and spoken. And so, Lévi-Strauss investigate a number of systems. However, his analysis of myth is the central interest to the students of popular culture. He claims that beneath the vast heterogeneity of myths, there can be discovered a homogeneous structure. In short, he argued that individual myths are example of parole, articulation of an underlying structure or langue. By understanding this structure, we should be able to truly understand the meaning of particular myths. Lévi-Strauss argued that myths work like language. They comprise individual analogies to individual units of language, the morphemes and phonemes.
According to Lévi-Strauss, all myths are structured in the same way. He also asserted that despite the fact that this isn't his main interest, but myths serve the same as socio-cultural function in society. To put it another way, myths' aim is to make the world a better place. To explainable, to magically resolve its issue and inconsistencies, according to him. And so, the objective of myth is to give a rational model that can resolve a conflict. Myths are stories that will tell us as a civilization in order to eliminate paradox and make the world understandable and thus habitable. They strive to reconcile us with ourselves and our existence. Woolwright and the American Western. Woolwright's 1975 examined the Hollywood Western with Lévi-Strauss' structuralist methods in sex, guns, and society. He claims that the Western narrative force comes from its structure of binary opposition. However, Wright varies from Lévi-Strauss that his goal is to demonstrate how the myths of a culture through their structure communicate a conceptual order to the people of that society, and not to reveal a mental structure. In short, whereas Lévi-Strauss is concerned with the structure of the human mind, Wright is concerned with the way the Western present a symbolically basic but impressively rich conceptualization of American social life.
Work on popular culture that concern with the processes of signification, the mechanism by which meaning are produced and put into circulation. Mythologies 1973 is a collection of essays on French popular culture. That Mythologies concludes with the important theoretical essay Myth Today. In the essay, Barthes outlines a semiological model for reading popular culture. He takes Saussure's schema for signifier or signified, is sign and adds to it a second level of signification. Barthes' model of reading is similar to that of the parole and language. The individual image is an example of parole, and the shared code or cultural repertoire is a form of language. In 1991, the Department of Education produced an advertisement in Empire magazine designed to attract men and women to the teaching profession. Image does not illustrate text. It is the text which amplifies the connotative potential of the image. He refers to this process as relay. The relationship can of course work in other ways. Example, rather than amplifying a set of connotations already given in the photograph, the text produces or invents an entirely new signified which is retroactively projected into the image so much so as to appear denoted there.
Post-structuralist. Post-structuralists reject the idea of an underlying structure which meaning can rest secure and guaranteed. Meaning is always in process. What we call the meaning of a text is only ever a momentary stop in a continuing flow of interpretation following interpretation. Saussure have noted posited language as consisting of the relationship between the signifier, signified, and the sign. The theorists of post-structuralism suggest that the situation is more complex than this. Signifiers do not produce signified, they produce more signifiers. Meaning, as a result, is a very unstable thing. In The Death of the Author, the now post-structuralist Barthes 1977 insists that a text is a multidimensional space in which a variety of writing. Only a reader can bring a temporary unity to a text, unlike the work that can be seen lying in apparent completion on library shelves and in bookshops. None of them are original, blend and clash. The text is a tissue of quotation drawn from the innumerable center of culture. And so the text is experienced only in an activity of production. A text is a work seen as inseparable from the active process of its many readings.
Jacques Derrida was an Algerian-born French philosopher best known for developing a form of semiotic analysis known as deconstruction, which he analyzed in numerous texts and developed in the context of phenomenology. He is one of the major figures associated with post-structuralism and postmodern philosophy. Derrida has invented a new word to describe the divided nature of the sign difference, meaning both to differ and to differ. Saussure's model of difference is special, in which meaning is made in the relations between signs that are locked together in a self-regulating structure. Derrida's model of difference, however, is both structural and temporal, meaning depends on structural difference but also on temporal relations of before and after. For example, if we track the meaning of a word through a dictionary, we encounter a relentless deferment of meaning. If we look up the signifier letter in the Collins Pocket Dictionary of the English Language, we discover it has 5 possible signified: a written or printed message, a character of alphabet, the strict meaning of an agreement, precisely as into the letter, and to write or mark letters on a sign. If we then look up one of this, the signified a written or printed message, we find that it too is a signifier producing 4 more signifieds, a communication from one person or group to another, an implicit meaning as in a work of art, a religious or political belief that someone attempts to communicate to others and to understand, as in to get the message. Tracking through the dictionary in this way confirm relentless intertextual deferment of meaning, the indefinite referral of signifier to signifier, which gives the signified meaning no respite so that it always signifies again. It is only when located in discourse and read in a context that there is a temporary halt to the endless play of signifier to signifier. Narrow position so important to structuralism is never simple structural relation. It is always a relation of power in which one term is in a position of dominance with regard to the other. Moreover, the dominance of one over the other, a matter of say, priority or privilege, is not something which arises naturally. out of the relationship, but something which is produced in the way the relationship is constructed. Black and white, it could be argue exist in a binary position, one always existing as the absent other when one of the terms is defined. But it is not difficult to see how is many powerful discourses what is the positive term holding the priority and the privilege over black. Even leaving aside racism, there is a long history of black connoting negatively and white connoting positively. Derrida refers to the strange economy of the supplement to point to the unstable interplay between such binary positions. In his analysis of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's confessional and linguistic writings, Derrida deconstructs the binary position between speech and writing. Rousseau considers speech as the natural way to express the thought writing. He regards a dangerous supplement, however, when presence is no longer guaranteed by speech, writing becomes necessary means to protect presence. But for Rousseau, writing can only be supplement to speech. It is not natural. It diverts the immediate presence of thought. It is sort of artificial and art follows to make speech present when it is actually absent. It is violence done to the natural destiny of the language. To supplement means to both add and to substitute. Writing is therefore both an addition to speech and substitute for speech. But speech itself is supplement. It does not exist outside culture. Speech cannot therefore play Edenic nature to writing's fallen culture. Both always already belong to the order of the supplement, for, as Derrida insists, the indefinite process of the privilege term in the opposition is shown to be dependent on the other for its meaning. We noted in chapter 1 how high culture has often depended on popular culture to give it definitional solidity. Derrida's critic of Rousseau's alerts us to the way in which one's side in such couplets is always privileged over the other. One side always claims a position of status of pure presence over the other. Derrida also demonstrates that they are not pure opposites. Each is motivated by the other, ultimately dependent on the absent other for its own presence and meaning. There is no naturally good girl who stays on the school, which can be opposed to a natural bad girl who wants to live at 16. Simply to reverse the binary opposition would be to keep in place the assumption already constructed by the opposition. We must do more than simply neutralize the binary opposition. One of the two terms control the other, holds the superior position. To deconstruct the position, we must overthrow the hierarchy. We must overthrow the hierarchy instead of accepting the double bluff. A deconstructive reading would wish to dismantle the couplet to demonstrate that it can only be held in a place by a certain violence, a certain set of dubious assumptions about the gender and sexuality. A deconstructive reading could also be made of Dances with the Wolves instead of the film being seen to invert the binary position and narrative function of right model. We might perhaps consider the film challenges the hierarchy implicit in the model. Discourse and power. Michael Fosol. One of the primary concerns of Michael Fosol is the relationship between knowledge and power and how this relationship operates in discourses and the discursive formations. Fosol's concept of discourse is similar to Althusser's idea of the problematic that is both are organized and organizing bodies of knowledge with the rules regulation which govern particular practices, ways of thinking and acting. Discourses work in three ways. They enable, they constrain, and they constitute. As Fosol, language, for example, is a discourse. It enables me to speak. It trains me, what I can say it constitutes me a speaking subject. It situates and produces my subjectivity. I know myself in language. I know myself in language. I think in language. I talk to myself in language. Academic disciplines are also discourses like language. They enable, constrain, and constitute. In table 6.4 outlines, you can see the different ways film may be studied. Each discipline speaks about film in a particular way, and in so doing it enables and constrains what can be said about film. But they do not just speak about film by constructing film as a specific object of study. They constitute film as a specific reality, the real meaning of film. Discursive formation consists of the hierarchical crisscrossing of particular discourses. The different ways to study film discussed earlier produces a discursive formation. In the history of sexuality, Foucault charts the development of the discursive formation of sexuality. In doing this, he rejects what he calls the repressive hypothesis that is the idea of sexuality as something essential the Victorians repressed. Instead, he follows the different set of questions like why has sexuality been so widely discussed, and what has been said about it? What were the effects of power generated by what was said? What are the links between these discourses, these effects of power, and the pleasures that were invested by them? What knowledge was formed as a result of this linkage? He tracks the discourse of sexuality through a series of discursive domains: medicine, demography, psychiatry, social work, criminology, governmental. Rather than silence, he encounters a political, economic, and technical incitement to talk about sex. He argues what the different discourses on sexuality are not about sexuality. They actually constitute the reality of sexuality. In other words, the Victorians did not repress sexuality, they actually invented it. This is not to say that sexuality did not exist non-discursively, but to claim that our knowledge of sexuality and the power knowledge relations of sexuality are discursive. Discourses produce knowledge, and knowledge is always a weapon of power. It is in discourse that power and knowledge are joined together. The Victorian inventions of sexuality did not just produce knowledge about sexuality. It is sought to produce power over sexuality. This was knowledge that could be deployed to categorize and to organize behavior. Divide it into the normal and the unacceptable. In this way, then power produces knowledge. Power and knowledge directly imply one another. There is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relation. Power, however, should not be taught of, of as a negative force, something which denies, represses, negates power is productive. Discourses are not once and for all subservient to power or raised up against it, any more than silence are. We must make allowances for the complex and unstable process whereby discourse can be both an instrument and an effect of power, but also an hindrance, a stumbling block, a point of resistance, and a starting point for an opposing strategy. Discourse transmits and produces power. It reinforces it but also undermines it and exposes it, renders it fragile and make it possible to thwart it.
The Panopticon is a type of Bresson building designed by Jeremy Bentham in 1787. At the center of the building is a tower that allows an inspector to observe all the prisoners in the surrounding cells without the prisoners knowing whether or not they are in fact being observed. According to Bentham, the Panopticon is a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind, and a quantity to a degree equally without example. He also believed that the Panopticon design might also be used in any sort of establishment, in which persons of any description are to be kept under inspection. Poorhouses, lazaretos, houses of industry, manufactories, hospitals, workhouses, madhouses, and schools. According to Foucault, 1979, the major effect of the Panopticon is to induce the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. Surveillance is permanent in its effect, even if it is discontinuous in its action. That the perfection of power should tend to render its actual exercise unnecessary. Panoptic surveillance that is constant and unseeing, sometimes barely visible, and the observed never engaged with the observers. The Panopticon is a disciplinary concept brought to life in the form of central observation tower placed within a circle of prison cells. From the tower, a guard can see every cell an inmate, but the inmates cannot see into the tower. Prisoners will never know whether or not they are being watched. The basic idea of panoptical control is that people will obey the prevailing rules and norms when they know they are being watched.